Okay, so we had left off, we were in the cerebral cortex, talking about these homeostatic imbalances. And I have just a little bit more to talk about in terms of the cerebral cortex. But really quickly, I kind of wanted to remind you of the big picture, if we could like step back for a moment. And remember that where we have been talking, that last lecture was just in the cerebral cortex of the cerebrum. So remember that we can break up the brain into four parts. The cerebrum, let me see if I can find it. Oh, there's a good diagram of the brain here. But remember, we've got the cerebrum here, which is basically like the cap of the mushroom. Then we have what's called the diencephalon, which you can't see here. It's the base of the stalk of the mushroom. And then we're going to have the brain stem, which is going to be this section here that goes all the way to the medulla oblongata and then eventually runs into the spinal cord. And then we're going to have the cerebellum. Okay, so those are the major parts of the brain that we're breaking them up into: cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and the cerebellum. And then, of course, we can break up each of those parts, which we do. But right now, we're just in the cerebrum. And we've just been talking about the cerebral cortex, which is that gray matter bark layer, right? That outer bark layer. And so today we're going to get into the white matter and the basal nuclei, and then we'll get into the diencephalon and the brain stem. And then I'll save the cerebellum for the next lecture. So we're going to finish up this last little bit again of just the cerebral cortex. So just the last few slides on the cerebral cortex. So when we talk about the cerebral cortex, we do have something called lateralization of some of our cortical functions. And that's basically just a division of labor between the hemispheres, meaning that some of the hemispheres are more dominant in terms of controlling certain, motor functions or certain behaviors. And so when we talk about cerebral dominance, really, and although one hemisphere or the other kind of dominates a lot of our tasks, the term cerebral dominance is really talking about language. What hemisphere is dominant for language? And that's your dominant hemisphere. That's what we consider to be your dominant hemisphere. So whatever that hemisphere is, it's also, again, the dominant one for your abilities for math and logic as well. So about 90% of humans have left-sided dominance. And as you can guess why, because remember again, when we're talking about this, we have that crossover, right? For a lot of our motor functions. So we call that contralateral. So again, 90% of us humans, if you're right-handed, again, because that motor function's on the right side, then you are left-sided dominance. Because when you're writing, that's associated with language. So if you're right-handed, you are left-sided dominant. Again, because we're just talking about cerebral dominance, just again for focus on language, math, and logic. Now, obviously, it's just the opposite, right? If you are left-handed, then you're right cerebral dominant. So again, only about 10% of the population is right cerebral dominant. I actually have a son who is right cerebral dominant as he writes with his left hand. And so what ends up happening is it's just the roles of the hemispheres are reversed. So again, the hemisphere that's dominant with language and abilities for math and logic in a left-handed individual is going to be the right hemisphere. Okay, so it'll just be just the opposite. So again, in most individuals, this is if you were right-handed. Okay, so again, it'll be flipped if you're left-handed. So keep in mind that this is for like 90% of the population that's right-handed. If you're right-handed, then your left hemisphere is going to be the dominant hemisphere for controlling language, math, and logic. And your right hemisphere is going to be the more free-spirited hemisphere that's associated more with like your visual spatial skills, emotion, your artistic and musical skills. So again, a lot of times we'll say someone's right-brained or left-brained, and that's not necessarily the way that things work, because remember that if, again, you're left-handed, these are just flip-flops, just the opposite hemisphere is controlling that. And so just because you're right-handed or left-handed doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be good at these different skills. It just means that the dominant hemisphere is flipped, okay? So for, again, an example of a left-handed person would have these hemispheres flipped, the dominant hemisphere is flipped. So again, left-handed person, language is going to be in the right hemisphere. Math and logic is going to be controlled by the right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere then will be associated with visual, spatial skills, emotion, artistic abilities, musical talents, things like that. Okay, so just be flip-flopped. And these hemispheres obviously communicate with each other almost instantaneously via these special integration fiber tracks that we'll talk about coming up here. So we can also talk about hemispheric lateralization in male versus female. I don't like to spend a lot of time on this. I'm not going to test you on this. It's just kind of some interesting things because, and the reason I'm not going to test you on this is that it's sometimes the case, but again, each individual is going to be different. So this is, again, making kind of generalizations as to what they see in the majority of, the subjects, but obviously it's going to be different in slightly different in individual to individual. But they typically do find that functional specialization of each hemisphere is more pronounced in men, focusing, and I'll talk about kind of what this means. And they did this using this diffusion tensor imaging on an MRI that actually maps out the diffusion of water molecules as, again, those neurons are firing and water is being used. So most of when this, again, is focused, when we have that focus in just one hemisphere, the connections are kind of running between the front and back of the same parts of that hemisphere. And that oftentimes can account for maybe some of the better spatial skills and motor muscle control that you see more in men. Again, generalization, because we see that in women too, and there's degrees, right, of this. And then females generally have the larger connections between the two sides, as you can see here, okay? And so those neural connections going from the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere can account for women's better verbal skills, as well as some of those intuitive abilities. Again, that's not to say that men aren't good at this too and don't have those connections, because, again, it's different in individual to individual. She's just kind of making generalizations of what they've seen percentage-wise. So again, same thing here. Overall, they find that typically, sorry, let me go back here, that typically men will have a larger frontal cortex, which can accommodate for some of those complex motor movements. They also typically have a larger amygdala, which we're going to talk about in the limbic system, which is associated with your fear response, your response to fear. And then hypothalamus, which is can control your food intake. So they have a larger hypothalamus. So again, and we'll talk about the amygdala and the hypothalamus coming up here. And then they typically have a smaller limbic system, which is your emotional brain. So we'll talk about the limbic system. And then women oftentimes have about 12% more neurons in the temporal lobe, which is associated with communication. Also, typically, women have a larger cerebral cortex and more gray matter. You can see the average percentage of gray matter in women is 55.4%, and male is 50.8%. So again, this tells us there are some kind of intrinsic differences, but that, again, those differences don't necessarily translate to different abilities. So again, take this with kind of a grain of salt, because obviously you're going to see that different areas of the brain are going to be more active in different individuals. So there may be some men that, again, have more activity in the limbic system than others, and so on. So again, differences in individual to individual, but just kind of interesting. So now we're going to get into the cerebral white matter. So again, remember the cerebrum, as we go back here, the cerebrum could be broken up into the cerebral cortex, the white matter, and the basal nuclei. So that's what we're going to go through now. The white matter, as you can guess, is white because it's got lots of those myelinated axons, okay? This is our second of the three basic regions of the cerebral hemisphere. And it's going to be obviously responsible for communication between different cerebral areas and between the cerebral cortex and some of those lower central nervous system areas like the diencephalon and the midbrain and so on. And so that cerebral white matter, again, is going to contain a lot of these tracks, okay, of axons. And it's going to consist of both myelinated fibers as well as some unmyelinated fibers are going to be in there. But mostly, again, lots of myelinated fibers because that's why it's white, hence the white matter. And we can classify these according to the direction that these tracks and fibers are running. So we have what are called association fibers. Association fibers are going to be running horizontal. And so you can see here's some association fibers right here. And those are going to connect to different parts of the same hemisphere. I'll show you this in kind of a better diagram in just a minute. So these are going to be really shorter association fibers that are going to kind of connect adjacent gyri. Okay, so this gyrus to this gyrus, and this gyrus to this gyrus. Your commissural fibers are going to be here some of your commissural or commissural fibers. And they're going to be these horizontal fibers that are going to connect the gray matter of the two hemispheres. So the commissural fibers are connecting the left and right hemisphere. And the biggest, the largest commissure that you're going to see is going to be the corpus callosum right here. So that's your largest commissure right here. And then again, you're just going to have lots of tracks that are connecting the left and right hemisphere. That's an important one to know. And the corpus callosum you have to know for lab as well. So that's why you have to know it. And then these projection fibers that you're going to see. So here's some projection fibers. They're going to run vertical up and down, and they're going to connect, again, hemispheres with lower portions of the brain, or again, into the midbrain, down into the brain stem, and eventually the spinal cord. Okay, so these projection fibers are going to be, again, taking sensory information into the cerebral cortex, and then motor output is going to leave the cerebral cortex through those projection fibers. Okay? So those are some important ones to know. And then this is just kind of nice because this shows you, I'm a visual person, so I like this to see the association fibers here, again, are running from like gyri to gyri within the cerebral, within the cerebrum here. And then you'll see the commissural fibers are going to be running from hemisphere to hemisphere, like your corpus callosum. So again, taking information from the left and the right hemisphere and connecting those two hemispheres. And then your projection fibers are going to sound just like, I like it because it's what it sounds like. Projection fibers are projecting that information from the cortex, from the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex down to lower areas of the central nervous system into the spinal cord. Okay? So I like those. These are some nice diagrams kind of showing you exactly kind of what's being connected by these different fibers. So again, these fiber tracks are very important because obviously they are connecting the different areas of the brain and allowing integration to occur. So then the third of these three basic regions of the cerebral hemisphere is the basal nuclei. And remember, the nuclei are these like islands of gray matter that we're going to find in the white matter. So these are just little islands of gray matter. And they're usually involved in control of movement. There are these three major parts of the basal nuclei, but I am not going to require that you know them, mainly because there is just so much for you to know. So I'm going to mention them. There's this, what's called the corpus striatum, I'll show you in just a minute, that's broken up into the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, as well as then you have these fibers of this internal capsule kind of running between and through the two of them. So here is basically how the basal nuclei are all kind of connected together. So these islands, you're going to see they're going to look like islands when you do cross sections here, because then you're just going to get a little section of that basal nuclei. But now you can see here how all the basal nuclei are going to be connected here. So again, that's where they're talking about that caudate nucleus, and the lentiform nucleus is going to be in here. So they're just all connected, but you do not have to know these different parts. Okay, so you can kind of cross that off of your list. I just want you to know the basics of what the basal nuclei are responsible for. So again, here you can see here's in pink here is the basal nuclei. These are again these islands of gray matter within the white matter. Now you can see that a little better there. So that's your basal nuclei. You're going to hear in some clinical settings, actually many clinical settings, they still use basal ganglia. But please remember, we try to save the term ganglia for the peripheral nervous system. So when you have, again, remember that gray matter is going to consist of cell bodies and dendrites. So when you have that gray matter in the central nervous system, we call it the nuclei. If you have, again, this kind of island of a bunch of cell bodies and dendrites in the peripheral nervous system, then we call it a ganglia. But I just like to mention here that I'm going to use basal nuclei because, again, it's the more proper term, the more proper anatomical term. But in clinical settings, you will hear sometimes basal ganglia. So not to get too confused, I just like to mention that. So if you hear that. So I did put basal nuclei / ganglia here, but technically they're really nuclei because they're in the central nervous system. Okay. So, functions of the basal nuclei. They're thought to, again, influence a lot of our muscle movements. So you're going to see, again, the basal nuclei are going to work in close contact with the cerebellum to really kind of control our movements and really influence those muscle movements that we're making, to really kind of refine our muscle movements. The basal nuclei also will they'll play somewhat of a role in cognition and emotion, again, as they're connecting some of these different areas of the cerebral cortex. They also can regulate the intensity of some of our slower or stereotypical movements. So what's a stereotypical movement, right? This is going to be a movement that you do that doesn't really have a purpose, and it's one that you don't necessarily think about. So for example, when you're walking, you swing your arms, okay? When you walk. Do you need to swing your arms to walk? Not necessarily. So this is one of those kind of stereotyped movements that we do, and that's controlled by our basal nuclei, which is why you don't voluntarily think about swinging your arms. They'll also filter out kind of incorrect or inappropriate responses, especially muscle moves, like inappropriate motor muscle movements. And they'll also inhibit antagonistic or unnecessary movements that are going to be the opposite of what you want. And the easiest way to picture these last two is to picture the case of an individual with Parkinson's disease. So an individual with Parkinson's disease will have some of these kind of, right, these unnecessary movements where they might shake or they're kind of jerky because they're not able to necessarily always inhibit some of those antagonistic muscle movements. So that's the easiest way to picture the function of those last two, is to picture an individual with Parkinson's disease that has damage to these basal nuclei. Also, Huntington's disease is another disorder that can affect the basal nuclei as well. So again, this is the case of Parkinson's disease, where damage to those basal nuclei oftentimes will result in tremors. Again, these unnecessary movements that we don't necessarily want. Rigidity, sometimes involuntary muscle movements, very jerky muscle movements. So again, I put Muhammad Ali up here because I did my research at Barrow Neurological Institute, and they have the Muhammad Ali Research Center there for Parkinson's disease, which is pretty amazing. And the basal nuclei will also help to initiate and terminate certain cognitive processes. And so individuals that may have some dysfunction, but especially between the basal nuclei and what we call the limbic system, will sometimes have disorders like obsessive compulsive disorder, where they're not able to terminate a certain cognitive thought process. They're so focused on it over and over and over. They can't terminate that. That's why they have to, touch that, 10 times. So they just can't, it's like they're stuck in that little loop. So that's, again, part of the basal nuclei's function is to terminate some of those cognitive processes, and things like obsessive compulsive disorder have some dysfunction in those basal nuclei. So again, it's always interesting to talk about the disorders, to know, really to understand what these different parts of the brain are doing. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and say goodbye to the cerebrum now. So remember, that was all in the cerebrum. So we're going to say goodbye to the cerebrum for now, and we're actually going to move down into the base of the mushroom stalk. So remember, the cerebrum was all of this. This was our mushroom cap, right? Now we're going to move down into the diencephalon, which is the base of the stalk of our mushroom, okay? And the diencephalon, again, that base of the stalk, is going to consist of 3 paired gray matter structures. It's going to consist of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus, which I'll show you in kind of it's a little bit harder to see in this image here. So I'm going to show you in a better image here in just a minute. And all 3 of these are going to enclose that third ventricle. So let me see if I can get this. Oh, it says it can't play the media. If you open this at home, you probably can play this. It won't play here, probably because of the screen capture program I have. So here, but it's cool. You can rotate the brain and look at this. You can also do this with some of the Sketchfab models of the brain that we have for labs. So if you want to go check those out, go into the lab section for the brain and check out some of those Sketchfab models, and you can manipulate the brain to see these different areas. So again, when we're talking about the diencephalon, we're going to be talking about the thalamus here. So here's your thalamus. And then we're going to be talking about the epithalamus, which you can see right back here, which is going to include something called the pineal gland. And then it's going to include this hypothalamus here. Now, what's cool is if you want to see when you're in lab and you want to see for dissection purposes, the pineal gland, all you do is you stick your fingers in here and pull up the occipital lobe of the cerebrum here, and pull it back from the cerebellum, and you'll be able to see this little pineal gland. Here, you can't really understand why they call it a pineal gland. It's part of the epithalamus. But if you look at this in lab, it actually looks just like a pine nut. So it makes more sense as to why it's called the pineal gland. So there are certain things, if you can look at some of those dissections and look at some of those, the images of the dissections, it might help you in terms of learning some of the names of these things. So as we talk about the diencephalon, we're first going to talk about the thalamus, and then we'll get into the hypothalamus and the epithalamus. The thalamus is going to be this little egg-shaped structure right here. So it's really easy to identify on like everything, on dissections, on brain models. So you can't miss this one. It's this big egg-shaped nuclei here. Again, bunch of gray matter. And just like we talked about, it's going to help form the walls of the third ventricle. You don't have to know on all of these. So I tell you if it forms the superior lateral wall. You do not have to know that. You just have to know where the third ventricle is. So it's going to make up, the thalamus is going to make up the majority of the diencephalon, about 80% of it. And that's because the thalamus is going to be a big relay station, massive relay station. So again, it's going to be for information that's coming into the cerebral cortex. And what it's going to do is it's going to take that sensory information and it's going to sort it okay, and relay it on to the higher areas that it needs to go to within the cerebrum or to areas like the hypothalamus. So again, it's going to take all of these kind of impulses that are coming in and send them off to where they need to go to. Do they need to go to the hypothalamus so that they can help regulate emotion and visceral function? Do these impulses need to go? And so again, this is taking, the thalamus is going to be a relay station both ways. So it can take information from the cerebral cortex as well and decide where that information, it's going to relay that information to where it needs to go. So some of those impulses might need to go to the hypothalamus to regulate emotion or visceral organ functions, to regulate some of our organ functions. And we'll talk about this. This won't make sense till we talk about the hypothalamus in a minute, but the hypothalamus is going to be heavily involved with releasing lots of hormones, like tons of hormones. So also it can take those impulses that are coming from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei to help kind of direct motor cortices. So they'll relay through the thalamus. And then oftentimes again, it'll relay impulses for memory or sensation integration that are again going through the cortex. So again, just think of the thalamus as a big relay station. It is the relay station, again, kind of sorting and taking things where they need to go. And overall, it'll act to help mediate sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, meaning like what parts of the cortex are going to be aroused, learning, and memory. So it's going to do a lot of these different functions. Because again, it's this big relay station. It's a big relay station. So again, if there's anything that I can emphasize about the thalamus, is that it's a big relay station, okay? The hypothalamus is going to be located below the thalamus. So it's going to be right down here is going to be the hypothalamus. And it's going to basically kind of form a cap over the brainstem. And again, it's going to form some of the inferior walls of the third ventricle. You don't need to know which walls. It's more importantly going to contain two really important structures, mammillary bodies and the infundibulum. So mammillary bodies, let me show you. These are going to be your mammillary bodies here, and they're going to kind of stick out. So again, this will be another structure that you can easily see on your dissections. And these are important because these are going to act as these big olfactory relay stations. So as olfactory information is coming out in through the olfactory neurons here, they're going to be relayed through these mammillary bodies. So again, that's one of the main purposes of those mammillary bodies, is just, again, to be a relay station only for your sense of smell, okay? So I like to tell you what the mammillary bodies do because you will have to know them for lab. So when you're looking for the purposes of lab, when you're looking for these mammillary bodies, you'll actually see all you have to do is find the pituitary gland and then the stalk called the infundibulum, and then look just behind that and you're going to see these little structures that are sticking out like this. Those are the mammillary bodies. Okay. Now, the other structure we talked about here is the infundibulum. And this is going to be the stalk that's going to connect the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Now, this pituitary gland, we're not really going to talk about because you were going to talk about it a lot when you do the endocrine system in 202. That pituitary gland is going to be responsible for releasing lots of different hormones. But the reason that the hypothalamus is going to be so important is that the hypothalamus is going to tell this pituitary gland what and when to release those hormones. So it's kind of like the control center for that pituitary gland, which is why it has this nice big stalk connecting the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. So because of that, you kind of have to know the name infundibulum. It's just a fun name to say too, infundibulum, right? And it's important, again, because, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go that way. It's important because it connects those very two important parts of the brain, okay? So again, infundibulum, you have to know, is that stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Make sure you know that one. Now, when we talk about the hypothalamus is going to control a ton of things. And the reason is this. The hypothalamus is going to control the secretions, just like I talked about, of all of the hormones that are being released through the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so again, it's going to have a lot of different functions. As you can see, there are lots of hormones that are going to be released from that anterior pituitary gland. You're going to spend a whole chapter pretty much on almost this. And then the production of posterior pituitary hormones. This is nice if you can learn this now. So the anterior pituitary hormones are not made by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus just releases certain hormones that tells the anterior pituitary what to release, but it doesn't actually make the hormones that are being released. Now, for the posterior pituitary hormones, there are two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. You do not have to know those now, but I'm introducing this because you will have to know them for 202. And the hypothalamus actually makes those. Why it doesn't make any of the anterior ones and then it makes all of the posterior ones is just how it works. There's not really an explanation as to why it works that way. It just does. But the hypothalamus does make the two hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary glands. Okay, they're the only two hormones that are released there. So kind of interesting. It actually makes those. So if you can learn that now, it really will help you out. But what ends up happening is all those hormones that are ultimately going to eventually be released from the pituitary gland are going to be big homeostatic control hormones. And what that means is because these hormones are going to do things like control the autonomic nervous system. They're also going to initiate all kinds of physical responses to emotion. Because those hormones are going to be involved with that, and the hypothalamus technically controls the release of those hormones, the hypothalamus is in control here. So the hypothalamus is this main visceral organ control center, as well as it's going to regulate the center that is really vital to maintaining homeostasis in our body. So again, it's going to ultimately control autonomic nervous system functions like blood pressure, rate and force of heartbeat, digestive tract motility, pupil size. So again, it's the control center that can release hormones that can alter those things, that can change those things. And then initiate certain physical responses to emotions. So again, your fear response, your ability to perceive pleasure, rage, biological rhythms, sex drive, things like that. Okay, those are things that the hypothalamus controls. Other kind of interesting things that the hypothalamus does. Hypothalamus is small but mighty. It does a heck of a lot. So you don't want to have damage to your hypothalamus. The hypothalamus also is our body thermostat. So it kind of sets our set point for the body. And you ultimately know this if you've ever had a fever. When you have a fever, oftentimes what happens is certain bacteria and things will cause your immune cells, as your immune cells engulf them or again come in contact with those bacteria, they'll release these certain proteins called pyrogens, and those pyrogens will actually go up to the hypothalamus and basically cause the hypothalamus, pyro means like fire, right? It's going to cause the hypothalamus to up its set point so that now it's going to set the thermostat for the body to be higher than it normally would. Obviously, this is a great idea because the virus or bacteria that entered your body entered there at the ideal temperature that it wanted, which was your body temperature. So now, your immune system's like, hey, I'm going to, jack up the temperature here. And it's going to do that through the hypothalamus. So hopefully that'll help you remember that the hypothalamus is going to be your body temperature set point. It's also going to regulate, it's going to be your center where you regulate hunger and satiety. So that satiety is your sense of fullness. in response to, there's a bunch of blood vessels that run around the hypothalamus. So it's going to be in response to the nutrient levels in the blood, like sugar levels in the blood, as well as certain hormones that are in the blood. So it'll regulate that feeling of hunger based on, again, that information that it's getting from the blood, from the nutrient levels in the blood. It'll also regulate your water balance as well, and thirst, by the kind of same mechanisms. So for example, like when your body fluids become like too concentrated, the hypothalamic neurons, that has these little receptors in there called osmoreceptors, are going to get activated, and they're going to excite the hypothalamic nuclei that are going to trigger the release of a hormone that's going to cause you to release less water in your urine. It'll also excite the thirst center in your brain. So again, the hypothalamus does all that. So the hypothalamus, again, you don't have to know the details on that. You'll get into that in 202 for sure when you do the urinary system. But you just have to know that it really helps regulate your water balance and thirst. It's also going to be part of, along with the epithalamus, in just a minute, we're going to talk about the portion of your brain that regulates your sleep and wake cycles. So it has this nucleus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. I know, right? It comes up with all these extravagant names. Suprachiasmatic nucleus. Of the thalamus that's going to set the hypothalamus that's going to set our biological clock. So again, that's, I don't like to emphasize that function as much. It helps to regulate that, but it's also, the epithalamus is going to do that. So we'll focus a little more on the epithalamus with this, because of the special hormone that it releases, melatonin. So again, this one I wouldn't test you on specifically with the hypothalamus, but I do want you to know the hypothalamus regulates water balance and thirst, hunger and satiety, regulates body temperature. Those are, again, important ones to know for the hypothalamus, as well as controlling endocrine hormones that are released from the pituitary glands. Those are big hypothalamus functions. As you can guess, because the hypothalamus, again, has all of these functions because it's controlling the release of hormones from the pituitary glands, any type of disturbance or disorder, dysfunction of the hypothalamus can cause some major disorders, severe body wasting, obesity, sleep disturbances, dehydration, emotional imbalances, all kinds of things. Again, you can see that you don't want to damage your hypothalamus. This is an interesting article. Again, I'm not going to test you on it, but it's kind of interesting. If you want to read it, it talks about how the Zika virus, when they've looked at infection in mice of the Zika virus, they've seen some impairment of the hypothalamus. And so anyway, you can kind of read that, and it talks about how it impacts growth and memory impairment. And the mice literally end up being these smaller mice. So it's kind of interesting. Also, the hypothalamus is probably one of the main drivers for failure to thrive. And that delay in growth that we see in development is, again, probably due to some disturbances in the hypothalamus, dysfunction in the hypothalamus. And that often occurs when children are deprived of warm, nurturing relationships, because the hypothalamus does have a relationship with the limbic system, which is our emotional brain. So, and we have seen this, you've seen this in, some of those old orphanages where they used to just set the babies in the cribs, and they didn't interact with them. They never picked them up. They never held them. And so a lot of those children ended up with hypothalamic disorders. And so they, again, wouldn't have hunger, because, again, that's controlled by the hypothalamus. And so they wouldn't eat very much. They had all kinds of delays in growth and development. And again, that was likely due to some dysfunction in the hypothalamus. So kind of interesting when you talk about the failure to thrive stories there. Okay, so the last part of the diencephalon is going to be the epithalamus. And the epithalamus is going to be this a little section back here. Again, you're going to have the pineal gland, and it's going to basically be the kind of dorsal portion of the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon. So the big structure in the epithalamus that we're going to talk about is this pineal gland. And the easy way to find the pineal gland, if you're ever looking on a dissection, on an actual dissection of a brain, is again, if you pull back the cerebrum from the cerebellum, you're going to look for, we're going to talk about them in just a minute, your superior and inferior colliculi, which are right here. So you're going to look for those first, and then you're going to see this little structure on top of it that sticks out. That's the pineal gland, or the pineal body. And again, it looks much more like a pine nut in real life than it does here. So it looks like a little pine nut sticking out, if you've ever seen a pine nut. And that's where it gets its name, the pineal gland. Now, this gland is really important for regulating our sleep-wake cycle because it secretes melatonin. So that melatonin is what's naturally secreted from the pineal gland at night when you're sleeping, again, to help regulate your sleep cycle. So now some individuals that are having trouble getting to sleep will take melatonin. And it's not bad to take melatonin. I mean, it's going to do what it needs to help you again get to that sleep portion of your cycle. The reason that they don't want you to take melatonin on a regular basis is that it can, if you're taking it chronically, it can decrease your natural production of melatonin from the pineal gland. So, just remember that's the case with anything in the body. If all of a sudden the brain's like, oh, I'm getting plenty of melatonin, well, I don't need to make any more of my own, then that's where it can become a problem. And when you're no longer making, your own melatonin. Okay, so it's not bad to take. I know a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to take melatonin. It's bad. It's not bad to take every once in a while here and there when you need to get to sleep, or if you're traveling. Sure, I bring melatonin for my kids when I'm traveling, but you just don't want to take it chronically, again, because you don't want to decrease your own production of melatonin. So that was just showing you the epithalamus and the pineal gland there. Again, here you can see that here's that epithalamus and the pineal gland. And so in just a minute, we're going to talk about the brain stem and the midbrain of the brain stem. And you'll see what's called the corpora quadrigemini, which is going to consist, I know you guys are just going crazy right now with all these terms, but you'll get there. And you're going to have these what are called superior and inferior colliculi. I'll help you out with those terms in just a minute. But if you look for those, and then look for the pineal gland right behind it. This will help you out with lab a little bit. So that pineal gland will be kind of right on top of those. Okay. So again, this is just showing you, this is kind of nice because this is just showing you some of the, what a dissection looks like. And I like the pineal gland in the dissection because it looks, again, more like this little pine nut here. Okay. So the pineal gland is depicted much better in an actual dissection. And then here you can see, to go back and talk about like the thalamus here, here's the thalamus and then the hypothalamus. So again, all of this is going to make up the diencephalon. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and say goodbye to the diencephalon here, and then we're going to move on into the brain stem. And as we move into the brainstem, you're going to see, and I even accidentally left some of them in my lecture, it's going to talk about the different, some of these different nerves that are going to be coming off, what we call the cranial nerves that are going to be coming off of this portion of the brain. You do not have to know, I'm not going to expect you to know, which cranial nerves come off of the pons, or which cranial nerves come off of, the medulla oblongata. So please, as you're looking at the lecture, you don't have to know, you will have to know the cranial nerve, the order of the cranial nerves, but you won't have to know what sections they're coming out from. So just as a heads up, I show you this so you can kind of see some of those cranial nerves as we're going to talk about the brain stem and the cranial nerves that are coming off, but you don't have to know what cranial nerves come off of what section. I'll try to remind you of that throughout. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the brainstem. And remember that the brainstem is going to consist of three major regions. It's going to consist of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So again, this would be the midbrain here. The pons is going to be this nice big little section right here that sticks out, the big rounded section. And then here's the medulla oblongata. Okay, so when you look at a cross section through the brainstem is going to be similar in structure to the spinal cord, which makes sense because it's going to be running into the spinal cord, except for it is going to contain some nuclei embedded in the white matter. But you'll see it's going to look a lot more like the spinal cord. So the brainstem is actually going to control a lot of our automatic behaviors that are necessary for survival. So our heart beating, and again, our ability to breathe, our again lungs, that ability for us to do respiration and respire. That's going to happen. I mean, obviously, you don't have to think about those things, right? So these are going to be these automatic behaviors that we don't have to think about, and they're going to go through the brainstem. It's oftentimes why the brainstem is referred to as the reptilian brain. So it's going to carry these kind of basic functions, right? And it'll also contain fiber tracts that are connecting the higher and lower neural centers, right? Which makes sense. I mean, things have to get from the spinal cord to the brain. So they're going to have to go through the brainstem. So it's also going to have a lot of these sensory and motor tracts, right, that are going to and from the spinal cord. And then we will have nuclei in there as well. We're going to talk about some of these nuclei, and some of those nuclei will be really important for, this is talking about nuclei associated with cranial nerves, but we are also going to have other nuclei that are going to be throughout the brainstem that are going to be associated with what's called our reticular activating system. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit throughout the brainstem, but I'm actually going to separate them out along with the limbic system in these two separate areas that we call kind of the functional systems of the brain. So we'll kind of separate out some of those nuclei as well. So again, this is just kind of showing you, here's where you find the midbrain, here's the pons, and then here's going to be the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata is going to be the portion of the brainstem that's going to run right into the spinal cord. Now, the midbrain, again, is obviously it is going to extend from the pons. The midbrain is kind of your first portion here. And let me show you where it is here. So here's your midbrain. It's going to extend from the pons to the diencephalon above it. So again, here's the pons, here's the diencephalon. So your midbrain is going to be right in between here. And if you look here, it has that cerebral aqueduct is going to run through it. That's going to connect the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. Again, remember those third and fourth ventricles are making cerebral spinal fluid. And so you'll see that cerebral aqueduct right through here. So let's talk about the midbrain in sections and kind of what the midbrain does. So you'll see that you can kind of break up the midbrain into, if you look at a cross section of it, into kind of some of these major functional parts. Here, the cerebral peduncles, it's just a fun word to say, cerebral peduncle, right? Is going to be mainly your like clusters of motor sensory fibers that are going to and from higher areas of the brain into the spinal cord, right? It's connecting higher areas of the brain and the spinal cord. So that's all your cerebral peduncles are. They're just these kind of clusters of tracts, sensory motor fibers. You do have this area inside those cerebral peduncles called the substantia nigra. And that substantia nigra is, I do want you to know that substantia nigra because it's going to be connected and functionally linked to those basal nuclei. And so this is going to be important to understand for things like Parkinson's disease. So these substantia nigra right here are going to be these kind of gray matter areas that are going to help control subconscious muscle activity. They're going to help, they actually contain melanin, which is why they look a little bit dark like that. And that melanin is a precursor to dopamine. And so they'll actually it actually releases dopamine from there. So you can release dopamine from there. And again, these areas are going to be functionally linked. Kind of the big thing for the substantia nigra, I think, is that they're functionally linked to those basal nuclei. So they're going to be helping you like control those muscle movements, and kind of, again, they're supposed to be kind of weeding out the muscle movements that, you know, are counteractive, the ones that are antagonistic and not necessary. And so what happens is degeneration of neurons in that substantia nigra, as you can guess, is a ultimate cause of Parkinson's disease. And so that degeneration oftentimes starts in the substantia nigra and then moves into the basal nuclei. And so because, again, the substantia nigra and the basal nuclei are so tightly connected, you can see how, again, these are the two major areas that are affected in Parkinson's disease. The red nuclei, I'm not going to focus on as much. Here's the red nucleus. The cortex and the cerebellum are going to just coordinate information through this red nuclei. So they'll help to kind of coordinate muscle movements through that red nuclei. But I'm going to kind of focus on more of the cerebellum in the control of that function. The red nuclei is just kind of like a track for it to move through from the cortex to the cerebellum. Okay, so for midbrain, again, I do want you to know a little bit about the substantia nigra. I do want you to know that, you obviously motor and sensory tracts have to move through there. And then I do want you to know the corpora quadrigemina. You must know the corpora quadrigemina. Quadrigemina, quad meaning four, right? So there are going to be these four. They look like these four little round pearls that are going to stick up here. And you can see them, again, quite well, depending upon, again, what view of the brain that you're looking at, or, again, what brain. Sheep's brain, a lot of times they have really prominent colliculi. So you'll see the corpora quadrigemina here are going to be these four hill-like structures. And that's actually where the name of each of these individual hills, called colliculi. So colliculi comes from the Latin origin collus, which means hill. So the colliculi are going to be these little hill structures. And we've got two of the superior colliculi, meaning they're superior, more on top, right? And then two of the inferior colliculi. So all of these, I know this gets confusing. So you've got your superior colliculi. Sorry, there's my mouse. Your superior colliculi here, and then your inferior colliculi here. All four of these, the two superior and the two inferior colliculi, make up the corpora quadrigemina, quad for the four colliculi. Okay, so hopefully that'll help make sense out of that. I think that's confusing for most students in lab as well. And this is kind of a cool view because, again, like I told you, you can pull back that cerebellum and look what's right on top of the colliculi, just like I told you, pineal gland. Okay, so look at that, perfect. It looks just like a pine nut. See? So you get to see that in the dissections. So again, now we're really going to focus on those superior colliculi and inferior colliculi separately because they do slightly different things. So these superior colliculi, the two hills on top here, are going to coordinate your eye movements with certain visual stimuli. So for example, if you're sitting there and you're like watching a fly, move across, as you track that fly, or a moving car is another example, maybe a better example. As you coordinate your eye movements to track that fly with that visual stimuli that's coming back in, that is all going through the superior colliculi. Okay, so your superior colliculi are doing that, coordinating those eye movements with that visual stimuli where that fly is. And so that happens in the superior colliculi. The inferior colliculi are going to coordinate your head movements with auditory stimuli. So, for example, you hear a loud noise, behind you, and you quickly turn your head around. That startle reflex that you have and turning your head in the direction of the sound goes through the inferior colliculi. Okay. So, or, again, if you're tracking the sound of a movement like that zoom of a car, your ability to, move your head as you hear the sound of the car go across would be through the inferior colliculi. Okay. So again, your ability to do that, the coordinating the eye movement, do visual tracking is superior colliculi. Your ability to do auditory tracking is your inferior colliculi. So kind of interesting. Those are the largest midbrain nuclei. So make sure you know the corpora quadrigemina. They're really important. Let's go ahead and talk about the next structure here, the pons, which is the second structure in the brain stem. And this is going to be located obviously between the midbrain here and the medulla oblongata right behind it. You're going to see the fourth ventricle right here is going to separate the pons from the actual cerebellum back here. Okay. And you're going to see that the pons is when you look at it, you can actually see all of these tracks. It's going to be composed of lots of conduction tracks. So it's going to have longitudinal fibers running through here, kind of towards the back of the pons here, that are going to connect, obviously, again, higher brain centers to the spinal cord. So again, those motor sensory tracks have to run through somewhere. They've got to run through this part of the pons here to get to those higher areas in the brain. Also, you're going to have transverse fibers that are going to be relaying impulses between the motor cortex of the cerebrum here and the cerebellum. Because as you're going to find when we talk about the cerebellum is really going to be in control of kind of controlling our fine-tuning our muscle movements, basically, fine-tuning those muscle movements. And so that's going to go through that connection between the cerebellum and those motor cortex areas of the cerebrum are going to go through the pons. That's going to make some of the major connections. Again, the pons has lots of cranial nerves going off of them, but you don't have to know which ones are coming off. So you can cross that off. Really important thing about the pons is that there are nuclei in the pons. There's also, these nuclei are also going to be kind of throughout the brain stem. So we're going to talk about this whole system separately. This is going to be part of that reticular activating system that we're going to talk about in a separate kind of functional brain section. But I just kind of want to remind you that they're going to be these nuclei that are throughout kind of the brain stem. And there's a lot of them in the pons. And they're going to be involved with kind of awakening the cerebrum. It'll be kind of your arousal of the cerebral cortex. Okay. So those are going to be found, and there's lots of them found in the pons. Also, the pons is going to help kind of oversee the medulla oblongata in its control of breathing. So remember, we talked about the brainstem being this reptilian brain, or we talk about the medulla oblongata in just a minute, kind of controlling breathing and controlling our heart rate, where, again, we don't have to think about it, right? It's this automatic reflex. So the pons is going to help oversee some of the rhythm of our normal rhythm of breathing that, again, is going to occur through the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the pons is kind of overseeing that. And so here you're going to see a lot of these little reticular formations. That's what I was talking about in terms of the arousal of the cerebral cortex. So when we get to that, kind of come back to this picture, and you can kind of picture those areas of the pons. So again, that's really all you have to know. We're not a lot on the pons. The medulla oblongata is going to be this last little section here that we're going to talk about of the brainstem, also sometimes just referred to as the medulla. And it's obviously going to blend eventually into the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. And so again, remember that large foramen in the skull, foramen magnum. And that's where the medulla oblongata connects to the spinal cord. It also contains the fourth ventricle. And remember that fourth ventricle, again, is making cerebral spinal fluid. But that fourth ventricle is also going to have to be continuous with that central canal that's going to bring, again, cerebral spinal fluid down into the spinal cord through that central canal. Some structures to know for the medulla oblongata. Again, we have to have these tracts that are, again, carrying sensory and motor function, right, from the spinal cord to the higher areas of the cortex. The areas that are going to carry these tracts, motor tracts from the motor cortex, are going to be called pyramids. So let me show you. These are these pyramids, and they're going to be carrying lots of these motor tracts that are coming from, again, the motor cortex. And it's important to know the medulla oblongata and these pyramids because you have this interesting crossover that happens in the medulla oblongata. It's called decussation. Decussation is a very fancy word. You know, we can't just say crossover. So it's a very fancy word for the crossover that's going to occur of these motor tracts in the medulla oblongata. So this is the reason why, again, your right cerebral cortex, right? Your right cerebral motor cortex is going to be controlling the motor functions of your left hand. It's because it's crossing over right here in that decussation of the pyramids right here. So you do need to know, that's why you also have to know that decussation of pyramids for lab as well. And that's a point where you get that crossover and that contralateral innervation is because of this. You also have these olives that are these little kind of swellings that relay stretch information from muscles. But again, here's the olives. I'm not going to expect that you know that it's kind of a smaller function of the medulla oblongata, and you guys just have plenty to know. So again, we can kind of cross that off of your list of things that I don't think you need to, required to know. When we talk about the medulla oblongata, there are some of these kind of more crucial functions. We already talked about, again, they're kind of a thorough way for passing, again, these ascending and descending tracts for sensory motor information from the spinal cord to, again, the higher areas of the brain. Also, their big crucial role is in these autonomic reflexes. So again, this is why oftentimes the brainstem is called the reptilian brain, because it's going to be responsible for these autonomic reflexes that we don't have to think about. So we have the cardiovascular center, which consists of the cardiac center and the vasomotor center. This, as you can guess, the cardiac center is just going to adjust the force and rate of our heart beating to meet our body's needs without us having to think about it consciously, right? So that cardiac center lies in the medulla oblongata. It's a reflex, okay? And so again, important part of our autonomic reflex. Also vasomotor, think of, again, blood vessel. So is going to adjust the diameter of our blood vessels to help regulate our blood pressure. And that, again, is going to happen in the medulla oblongata. This is an autonomic reflex. You don't have to think about, I need to increase, blood pressure to this, area to provide, more blood to the brain or whatnot. You don't have to think about that because that happens through that vasomotor center, okay? So that's a major crucial role for the medulla oblongata. I want you to know that one. And then the second one is that the respiratory system runs through here. Again, the pons helps to regulate this as well. And that respiratory center is going to generate your respiratory rhythm, how fast you're breathing. Again, you can obviously consciously overwrite that, like as you make yourself take a big breath in. But when you're not thinking about it, when you're just sitting there listening to this lecture, not thinking about your respiratory rate, that's because it's going through this respiratory center in the medulla oblongata that's controlling your respiratory rate as well as your depth of breathing, okay? So the respiratory center, cardiovascular center are in the medulla oblongata. And that is why this is oftentimes called the reptilian brain. Also, other reflex centers here that you can thank the medulla for. Every time you cough, sneeze, swallow, vomit, or hiccup, you can thank the medulla oblongata. Those are all reflexes that go through the medulla oblongata. So again, the next time you have the hiccups or you're sneezing or vomiting, unfortunately, hopefully not, you can thank your medulla oblongata for those lovely reflexes. This is just to kind of remind you that, again, that brainstem is oftentimes called the lizard brain or the reptilian brain. And that's because the medulla oblongata has these major autonomic reflexes, these kind of basic reflexes required for life. Okay, so and this just is, again, a nice cross section so you can see all of these different parts. You can see the midbrain here, pons, and the medulla oblongata, all of the brain stem there quite well. And it even shows you, again, the corpora quadrigemina of the midbrain here. So nice images there for you. I'll stop here and I'll start with the cranial nerves on this next section. I'm just going to briefly go over them for lab purposes, and then we'll get into the cerebellum.